And good morning, everybody. I'm so glad to have you with me, and also to have Harley Schlanger of the LaRouche organization with me once more for a update on what Harley's been working on and conversation about current events, which looks to me to be pretty important right now. So, good morning, Harley, or good afternoon to you over there in Potsdam, Germany, and
Hello,
welcome. Thanks for being
hello,
here.
hello, John, and hello to all your viewers and listeners, and it's good to see you again.
Thank you so much. Well, it's kind of you to allow me to maybe suggest the first topic today, which was, I came up with this idea this morning here at about 6 in the morning, and I said, you know what? One of the big differences that I see between me and the folks that follow me and Harley and the LaRouche organization is that I am very much concerned about the jab mandates. And I'll just use that word because if we don't want to get the show shut down. But on the other hand, I think, the concern about war with Russia and, folks talk about nuclear war with Russia as that being the biggest threat. Well, I thought I'd just do a poll on just a simple, meaningless poll, but it's on my Twitter here, and I want to share that just so people can see where we're at with it, just for fun. Where is it? There we go. So, as you can see right now, current tally is 38 votes. 76% for stopping the jab mandates is the most urgent, and 23.7% stopping the US Russia war is most urgent. And I also had two people comment saying both. So I don't think both can be is an answer. It's not much we can argue there. So let's stick to one or two. Harley, where's your vote come down?
Well, I think I just told you very simply, if we don't stop nuclear war, it doesn't matter whether you're jabbed or not, because the world is going to be, if whoever survives is going to be in a miserable situation. So, from my standpoint, we'd better stop the war. Now, there are a lot of things you can say. I mean, I'm not convinced that the vaccine is going to kill everybody, but on the other hand, I am convinced that if we have a nuclear war, it's going to devastate the planet. Now, the problem we face is, the question of, is it possible to stop either? And I think that if people want to spend a lot of energy trying to stop something, I would urge them to do something to stop the war hawks, the people like Helga is calling him Senator Wicked from Mississippi, the one who says we should use nuclear weapons against Russia and Ukraine. The war hawks are truly out to start a war. And we can go through some of the details. But I think on the other side, if people are passionate about the idea of saving lives, the place you'll save the most lives is if we stop a nuclear war. But I know the other argument, John, is people say there's nothing we can do about that, but maybe we could stop the jab mandate. So, I think we need a higher dose of optimism in fighting for what's necessary for mankind.
Well, yeah, I'm all for a higher dose of optimism. I do my best to stay on the sunny side of it. But let me come back at you now with something from the other side that I don't know if you've considered, but let me just toss it out there. There are reports, and for the sake of the question, let's not just debate whether this is reasonable or not. Let's just say that okay, they have developed a way with little tiny nanotechnology to put inside of every human being an identifying marker that would be unique to that human being, and that they can then, with radio or some other way, track you and keep track of where you are from time to time. The elaborations are that they can tell your temperature, your blood pressure, things like health monitoring computers do right now if you put on one of those wristwatches. But this is teeny tiny nanotechnology that, doesn't really hurt anybody, but it goes in there. And so if that's what is really behind this campaign to get a needle in every arm of, 7 some billion people on the planet. Um, is that not a huge concern that we are going to find ourselves irrevocably tied down into a totalitarian regime that can control us by knowing exactly where we are and probably with the technology they have at this point, do terrible things to our health if they choose to. Um, that kind of scenario, I don't think has been discussed much in among my friends at the Schiller Institute or LaRouche. And in fact, I think that if I were to take a poll at the LaRouche organization, it would be like 99 to 0 in favor of don't even worry about the jabs. Don't even think about the jabs. The jabs are not worth thinking about. That's the great impression that I get from folks at the Schiller Institute. I don't know if that's fair to say or not, but why is there this great disconnect between the folks that follow McDuff and the folks that follow LaRouche?
Well, let me simply say that if I saw something that was credible evidence that there were these technologies that were being used, that might change the situation. But I see a few websites that allege that and have not seen evidence of that yet. But let's go a step further. If you have a mobile phone, you can be tracked wherever you are anyway. If you have
Yeah,
a computer at home, I mean, this is what Snowden pointed out. They know what you're doing and what you're thinking by just tracking you through various NSA technologies. So, we're still fighting the same problem, which is that you have an establishment which is trying to control not just where you go or what you do, but how you think.
right.
And that's also being done through social media. So, I think people have to really step back and take a look at what's at stake here, what's being done, because the people who are doing that are the same ones who are pumping you full of anti-Putin stuff, anti-China stuff, uh, global warming lies. We're inundated with psychological warfare. And when you have to decide which element of psychological warfare am I going to fight, I think you have to climb to the mountaintop and figure out not just which could you win, but what's the most important one to win. And the most important one to win is to take power away from this criminal cabal that's engaged in all this activity, which would, if they could use vaccines to control people, would probably do it.
Why do you think they're not already in control of places like Pfizer and Moderna?
Well, I think they are, but as I've said, John, I have not seen any credible evidence that shows that. I mean, I've read about the graphene and some of these things, little tiny razors in the
Yeah, I saw that.
jabs.
That's a distraction. I don't want to
Well,
spend time.
but that's what I'm saying. A lot of people are being scared by scare stories that are being put out by some of these websites that are trying to sell health food and things of that sort. I haven't seen evidence that Pfizer has the capability to do what Mark Zuckerberg is trying to do with the metaverse. So, again, I think there's a higher order danger that comes from this war hawk faction that also controls the banking system, the financial system, that with the Great Reset is about to put you into a situation where you won't be able to go anywhere anyway, because you won't have any money or any ability to go anywhere. So, I think we have a higher priority in stopping this criminal cabal than focusing on one particular aspect of it.
Well,
If
I
that
agree.
makes sense.
I,
I don't
I
know.
I agree with it that it's a criminal cabal, and I happen to think that the big pharma is some of the biggest criminals in the cabal. And maybe I'm wrong, but it sure does look that way to me. So I don't trust them, and I think that this has been a $2 or $3 trillion holdup of the American taxpayer, which they've gotten, and it's if it's just a holdup, then fine, we can refinance. But if it's something that's going to affect the future of humanity, affecting birth rates, affecting uh, the health of children generations down the road, and changing our DNA. Now, maybe it's not changing our DNA, and maybe the crackpots or the throws that are scaring people are really crackpots and throws and disinformation. But nevertheless, I think there's sufficient concern that we need to follow up on the what's really in those jabs. It's all a secret. They have no liability. They have been completely exonerated by all the legislatures in the world, and and then put it together with Klaus Schwab's book, The Great Reset, which I have right here on at my hand, where he says COVID-19 is the opportunity of our lifetime to perform the Great Reset. And what is the major part of the Great Reset? It is everybody has a mark. Everybody has a number. And that, I think, is a case that really needs to be looked at least as hard as the fear of nuclear war right now. But there's where we differ.
Well, I'll say this: Klaus Schwab is a certifiable lunatic, and I'm not sure I take everything that he says that he's doing and can do for granted. But more importantly, we can stop him. We can stop this stuff. And the way we can stop it is going at the heart of it. Because when you talk about big pharma, I've spoken against big pharma for years. I think one of the biggest problems that people are overlooking when it comes to this question of pandemics and diseases and things of that sort is that is the group, big pharma, along with for-profit hospitals and insurance companies, that's destroyed the public healthcare system of the United States and Western Europe. And so it's made us vulnerable. The starting point should be, why did we ever tolerate Obamacare, which was pushed through largely through the work of Ezekiel Emanuel, who we identified as Ezekiel Emanuel, the brother of Rahm Emanuel, who is the one who came up with this idea that people shouldn't live beyond 75 years. So there's very definitely a death cult involved in some of these aspects of the corporate cartels, of which big pharma is a major one. But same thing with the insurance companies, same thing with the banks and the financial institutions, the same ones who are at this point using the Great Reset to establish a new colonial system where they're going to use the Green New Deal to have a climate police that will not allow any investment to go into new technology in energy production, electricity production, and instead make the world dependent on these less energy flux dense systems like solar and wind that can't provide enough electricity to take care of 7 billion people. So there are a lot of threats to the future existence of mankind. And what I'm saying and the LaRouche movement has been saying is, instead of focusing on one which may be overstated, let's get at the heart of the enemy. One of my friends once put it this way: if you're surrounded by spider webs, go find the spider. And what we have to do is find the people who are behind these things and identify them, identify their methods, and find their vulnerabilities. And right now, what we're seeing around the war drive in Ukraine shows the biggest vulnerability that these financial corporate cartels have, which is that Russia and China in particular are resisting the Great Reset, the Green New Deal. They're resisting the policies that are being pushed. And that's why they're moving towards a war, trying to provoke something with Russia. But here's the reality: they're not going to be able to succeed. If they do get a war with Russia, Russia is holding a better hand when it comes to the military situation right now, certainly in terms of Europe. And if the Russians end up being provoked into a war with Ukraine, they'll crush Ukraine. And Biden has already said, we're not going to send soldiers to Ukraine. So why try to provoke Russia by putting nuclear missiles and NATO forces inside Ukraine? This is a fight over whether the British American, the Anglo-American system of looting, of speculation, of shutting down physical production, of reducing population will succeed. Now, if you and others are right that the purpose of the vaccine is to set up a marker or even to kill off people. I mean, I keep reading these people who they say are doctors, many of whom are doctors of sociology or something else, who are saying that if you get a shot, you'll be dead within 2 years. You know, there's a lot of scare propaganda out there. I could tell you personally, John, I know of no one who's had a vaccine who's died from it. I know several people who didn't get a vaccine who died. So, you know, I think there's a lot more investigation. And part of the problem is, and this I agree with you on, there's no reason to trust either the word of government or the pharmaceutical industry. So, you know, to quote Ronald Reagan, trust but verify. But I'm not sure we have verifiable evidence on either side yet.
Well, I think you just made the best case for the primacy of individual rights over government intrusion, which is what my case is that, you know, I don't know the answer. Can I trust the government? If I can't, if I don't know that I can trust the government, then it's my job not to trust the government. That's my position. So,
well, but you have to use the best evidence that you have available, and perhaps we're looking at different evidence. Perhaps there are other things like that. But on this fundamental question that you asked in your poll, this danger of nuclear war is something that most people tend to not want to look at because, number one, it's so frightening to think about. And secondly, people don't think they have any way of doing anything about it. I've been giving many interviews and presentations recently where people simply say, but we can't stop them. They're too powerful. Well, if that's the case, how are you going to stop them in anything that they intend to do? And, you know, I can assure you that the other thing that people are missing is that the driver for this is the systemic collapse of the financial system. And, you know, I just put out in my update today some figures that came from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund about what happens with interest rate hikes, which the Federal Reserve and all the central banks are committed to now, supposedly to fight inflation. And what they're saying, what the World Bank is saying, is that this will trigger defaults in the poorest and most indebted countries who are holding trillions of dollars of debt that they're supposed to pay off. And how do they pay it off? Well, the International Monetary Fund comes in and says you have to stop building roads, building hospitals, feeding people. You have to pay the debt first. Now we're talking about trillions of dollars. 47% of this debt is owed to private lenders. So it may be your pension fund that's holding the debt of Zambia. By the way, John, you know who one of the largest debtors and most in danger of defaulting is? Ukraine. Because
yeah.
since the 2014 coup in Ukraine, who did they bring in? They brought in the International Monetary Fund, which carried out the typical austerity conditionality policy for Ukraine. As a result, its standard of living has collapsed. The per capita debt has skyrocketed. The currency has been devalued repeatedly. And meanwhile, the people in Ukraine are being told they're about to be invaded. Now, there was a poll taken in Ukraine, and a large percent of the Ukrainian people said they're not worried about an invasion. In fact, there's a really funny statement, if I can find this. Yeah, the former Ukrainian defense minister, whose name is Zagorodnyuk, who worked very closely with Zelensky, he said that one of his friends, who's a top advisor to President Zelensky, said that they don't believe there's any imminent threat to Kiev. The idea that evacuating American families from Kiev, which the State Department has now ordered, they see that as utterly ridiculous. And here's his comment. I think this is somewhat precious. He said, these Americans who are here are safer in Kiev than they are in Los Angeles or any other crime-ridden city in the United States. So from the outside, we're looking at this as though Russia's about to march through the country and start pillaging and looting and killing, when the looting is being done by the International Monetary Fund with the full backing of NATO and the United States. So, you know, we're looking at a situation where what Putin has said is that Russia is asking for security guarantees because they don't want offensive weapons and nuclear missiles on their border that could reach Moscow within 5 to 7 minutes. And Biden, a little less strenuously, but certainly Blinken and Liz Truss, the British foreign minister, they're saying we have a right to put missiles anywhere we want. But then they say to the Russians, you're not allowed to put troops on the border. Well, the Russians keep saying these are troops inside Russia. They're not crossing the border. So we're dealing with a situation where within the next 5 or 6 days, the United States will be responding to the demands by Putin that there be a written response to these 2 draft treaties that he's proposed. Ukraine could not go into NATO. There'll be no advanced weapons deployed on Ukrainian soil. And there must be an agreement to push through the Minsk Accord, where the Ukrainians are supposed to negotiate directly with the Russian population of eastern Ukraine. Ukraine has said they're not going to do it. Up to this point, Blinken said that's a non-starter. But they did, after the meeting of Blinken and Lavrov, agree that the United States would give a written response. So we're sort of waiting for the next 5 or 6 days. It's sort of like a slow motion Cuban Missile Crisis to see whether the US is going to agree to what Putin is asking or not. That's why I think this is something that if people actually studied the issue, they'd be completely angry, maybe hysterical, and out in the streets. We're seeing a certain revitalization of the anti-war movement in Europe, especially since the new German foreign minister was saying, well, maybe we would take new nuclear weapons in Germany. And the chancellor said, no way. There's a fight going on in the open on this in Germany. A top official in the German military, an admiral, gave a speech in India where he said, look, Crimea is not going back to Ukraine, and Putin is just asking for respect. Isn't that a relatively cheap price to pay for peace? And he was forced to resign. So there's a huge fight going on behind the scenes. And there are some in the US military who are saying, we're ready to go. We need more troops. Yesterday, Biden activated a plan to send 8,500 US troops in case Russia invades Ukraine, with another 50,000 on standby. But there are others in the military saying, why are we going to take a risk that we're going to have these soldiers wiped out from hypersonic attacks from Russia? Why not negotiate? Why not diplomacy? So that's my case for the need to address this war threat, because the war threat comes from people who have no concern for your future, your health, and it goes across the board. So you may not trust them for what they're telling you about the COVID situation, but I know you cannot trust them when it comes to the economy, and certainly not to this strategic crisis.
The economy is what I guess worries all of us too. I had no idea that the Ukraine had taken on debt in connection with the IMF as a result of the American-sponsored, or let's say American spook-sponsored Maidan revolution, which forced what was her name? Yaroshenko? I can't remember her name. Yanukovych out of office, and really to flee, I think. But now
for his wife.
But see, there it is. There's the old game, as you just pointed out, of get them hooked on national debt, and then you control the government.
Well, what happened is the question that Yanukovych was caught in a bind on was, it's clear that a large section of the population in Western Ukraine, or at least a small majority, wanted to be integrated into the European economy. Whereas most of Eastern Ukraine includes ethnic Russians, Hungarians, Poles, and others, many of whom had good jobs when it was tied to the Soviet Union, because that was part of the industrial manufacturing sector. Also, that's where weapons were being produced. But they had a desire to remain connected to Russia. And so when the Maidan occurred, the big question was, that was being posed is by the people who were trying to get rid of Yanukovych, is that he was proposing a neutrality neither, or negotiating both with the EU and with the Eastern European Russian bloc. And they were saying, no, it has to be the European Union. And this is where we see the US intervention on behalf of the EU and NATO. Victoria Nuland was overheard was tapped actually on a cell phone talking to the US ambassador, choosing who the next president of Ukraine should be, talking about Yatsenyuk. Yats is our guy. Now, we talk about democracy and not imposing your desire on internal affairs in other countries. There she was in the Maidan Square telling the US ambassador who he should tell the Ukrainians they should make their next president. As she was handing out cookies on the Maidan, as American forces such as George Soros, the National Endowment for Democracy, the International Republican Institute, were handing out $5 billion to radical right-wingers who included neo-Nazis to shoot up Maidan Square and blame it on Yanukovych. So we're on the wrong side in everything when it comes to Ukraine. And what was one of their biggest complaints? Well, Ukraine was corrupt. Well, there were oligarchs in Ukraine. What we did is we made sure that only the pro-Western oligarchs got contracts, and they received the blessing of the International Monetary Fund to carry out austerity, to cut out, to direct the question against the debt. But what does that mean? Pay the debt first. So the oligarchs get their slice and the international banks get their slice. And what's left for the Ukrainian people? Well, Ukraine, the population for all the people in Europe, including East Europe, Ukraine is near the bottom. There are only two countries, I think Moldova and one other, that have lower per capita income than Ukraine. It used to be in the upper 50% in Europe. So, and the person who is the authority on this is a friend of the Schiller Institute, Natalia Petrenko, who runs a political party in Ukraine, which has been shut down and suppressed by the Ukrainian government, supposedly the democratic Ukrainian government. So if people actually study this, what you see is the full hypocrisy of this idea of a rules-based order, of a democracy versus autocracy. It's amazing that just last week there were sanctions issued against 4 Ukrainians by the US State Department, 2 of whom were members of an opposition party in the parliament. So we're sanctioning members of parliament in Ukraine, as well as an independent media company, in the name of democracy and freedom of the press. So, you look at this and you just say, how is it possible that people can tolerate someone like Blinken going around lecturing the world about democracy? Not to mention looking at Yemen or Syria or Afghanistan or what we're trying to do to Venezuela and what we're doing to the American people with the Patriot Act and censorship and so on. So we've got to stop this cabal. It's got to be defeated. Their weakness, John, is that if countries get the idea that they can walk away from their debt, this is what LaRouche called the debt bomb back in 1982, 1983. And it caught on. It was actually the cover story, I think it was January 1983 of Time magazine. It showed South America with a bomb on it. It was called the debt bomb. That was LaRouche's idea. He proposed it to Mexican President Jose Lopez Portillo, who said, this is a good idea. Now, what does it mean? It means instead of paying your debt to speculative looters, you keep your money internally and invest it in physical economics. Now, what would happen? You'd get cut off from the SWIFT transaction system. You'd get cut off from loans from the West. Well, what if there were an alternative? Until now, there hasn't been an alternative. But what we're seeing, because of the economic strength of China, the establishment of new banks like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Bank, or the various banks connected to Eurasian development, there's now a fund that's available that if the United States tries to kick Russia out of the SWIFT system or conduct economic warfare, escalate the economic warfare against Russia and China, they're moving toward establishing an alternative where you would have maybe 100, 150 countries join it. What would that do to the Western financial system if you had 54 countries default on their debt? What would that do if they pulled out of the agreements to slash their spending so they could pay the debt first? This is what the economic hitman story is all about. You send in the IMF and they bring with them mercenaries who kill off the people who are against paying debt first and impose financial dictatorship. Well, I think we're in a period where we have potential allies all over the world. Plus, as you point out, many Americans now are very frightened about their economic future because of inflation, because of the job situation, because of the shutdown of the physical economy, manufacturing economy. We have an opportunity if people figure out what LaRouche was proposing with the Hamiltonian credit system and canceling the speculative debt, writing it off as bad gambling debts. Well, we have a chance to start a financial system based on physical economic production, which is how the American system started after the Revolutionary War. We could do that now with support of many countries around the world. So why should we submit to an oligarchy that we can't trust and that's proven that it will lie and kill? So that's why I think the bigger picture is where we have to put our efforts.
One of Helga Zepp LaRouche's initiatives is that the United States should withdraw from NATO. And I think a withdrawal from NATO and disassociation with the Atlantic Council would be one of the best things that we could do if we could get our politicians to do it.
Absolutely.
In disassociating ourselves with these oligarchs, the oligarchs gained financial power here. Well, the current version is the Federal Reserve System. And the Federal Reserve System needs to be declared unconstitutional because it is. And if we were able to, through Congress, to overturn the Federal Reserve designation of itself as, kind of the central bank of the United States and thereby the world, we could undercut this. And the idea of these pieces of paper we carry around in our wallets, or those of us that still have real paper currency, is that, this currency is not money. It's just a piece of paper. It can be deflated as fast as as the Weimar Republic's money was deflated. It's just a piece of paper. Now, I say that piece of paper belongs to the Federal Reserve, and let them keep them. And let's start a federal, a United States monetary system with real money, not currency, but money. Money meaning coins, meaning something that has intrinsic value. It could be a piece of paper with some platinum in it interlaced, but it's got to have it's got to have value to itself to be money. And that's where we've gotten fooled, for at least 100 years now, is that they are able to circulate these pieces of paper called Federal Reserve notes and have the full faith and credit backing of the United States government. And that's what has to stop, in my opinion. Stop backing private money, private banks' currency.
Well, it's the private banks that own the Fed. I mean, the most interesting story that's come out recently on this is in the Wall Street on Parade blog page, where they've been covering something that no one else will touch. I mean, we cover it, but Pam and Russ Martins have been running a series of stories about under Dodd-Frank, which is for the most part a banker protection bill. But they had one thing where they said the Federal Reserve, within 6 quarters of doing something, has to report what they did. So they just released the findings, the figures on what happened in the last quarter of 2019. They released it, of course, on December 30th, when few people would see it. But all the financial media would have seen it. And what it showed is that starting on September 17th and 18th, 2019, there was something big that happened. And they think it was a derivatives blowout related to the Thomas Cook bankruptcy, the British travel agency. But it could have been a derivative that was held by and sold by JP Morgan Chase. But something big blew out. so that the ordinary process of overnight accountability, called the repo markets, that if a company needs to borrow money overnight, they can go to a bank, and a bank can go and get money for them in return for some financial instrument for 24 hours. So they have the cash to pay something on what they owe, so they stay solvent. What happened is that instead of needing 5 to 10 billion over that 24-hour period, the demands went to 20, 30, 50 billion dollars to roll things over overnight. Pretty soon they stopped doing it on a 24-hour basis and moved it to a 14-day basis, then basically permanent rollover. And it went up to hundreds of billions of dollars. And so the Fed had to step in because the banks couldn't do this anymore as of September 18th, 2019. And so what the Federal Reserve just released the figures, it was $11.8 trillion that was put into these repo loans in the fourth quarter of 2019. 11.8 trillion. That's 3/4 of the annual GDP of the United States. And where did it go? Most of it went to a handful of banks, about 12 banks, but the vast majority of it went to 6 banks, which included JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Citibank, Bank of America, Deutsche Bank, and Nomura Securities. There are a couple of others, but they got 8 trillion out of the 11.8 trillion. Now here's the real scandal. This was money created, as you say, it's not real money. It was created as debt by the New York Federal Reserve. Who are the banks that own the New York Federal Reserve? The private banks that are the largest shareholders: JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, and Goldman Sachs Bank. So they were creating, through the Federal Reserve, billions of dollars, trillions of dollars of fresh solvent liquidity to pay themselves, to give to their clients, to roll over bad debt. That's what kept the monetary system going. And more importantly, it kept the stocks of these banks up. It gave money to corporate companies that were zombie corporations. They didn't make enough profit to pay the interest on the debt. Now they could keep in business, get free money, and so they would remain liquid, even though they were insolvent. So LaRouche had proposed in 2008 a solution. We have to take the companies that are not solvent, and instead of giving them liquidity to buy their own stock, put them through an orderly bankruptcy proceeding. And if they don't have the funds or the capability to generate the funds, shut them down. Let the shareholders eat the debt. Instead, under the US Federal Reserve System, they get bailed out. But if you can't pay your mortgage, or if you can't pay your credit cards, you lose. They're not going to give you that benefit. So we saw in 2008, more than 6 million families lost their homes in foreclosure. Who bought up those homes? Companies like BlackRock, a bank called IndyMac, and you know who was the CEO of IndyMac? Steve Mnuchin, who became Trump's Treasury Secretary. BlackRock, which is buying up homes like crazy now. Larry Fink of BlackRock was the person who was given charge by, again, President Trump to oversee the COVID relief system. So these same criminals who create the crisis end up doling out the Federal Reserve money. Now, the alternative, what you were talking about before, the alternative is to shut down the Federal Reserve System and do it through the Treasury, which is what John Kennedy started to do in June 1963 with his Executive Order 11110. And I have some associates who are convinced that that was the final straw, that while Kennedy was trying to set up a back channel with the Soviet Union, he was opposed to the Vietnam War, but his move against the Federal Reserve System may have signed his death warrant.
Yeah, it may have. And that's all connected with, the big financial system of the world and who's in control of it. That's quite a rabbit hole. I'm going to try to steer back away from that just because it's so complicated. My I read recently in your publication, EIR, Executive Intelligence Review, available at larouchepub.com, and it's a great thing to just open up and start reading, folks, if you need something to stimulate your brain, because they're great writers too. But one of the things that I'm most recently read, I said I'm going to study a little bit about Henry Wallace. And here's a quote from Henry Wallace. He says, "I'm for the dollar and I'm for the man. But between the dollar and the man, I'm for the man." And I think that says it. That's why he wasn't successful as a politician in this country, because the, the 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 trend is for the dollar. That is, we will protect that dollar no matter how many Americans die, no matter how many people around the world die. We're for the dollar. We're not for the man, and that's I think is the big tragedy. That is the Federal Reserve System. It's imposed itself in a way that is so entangling that you can't fight it. Individuals cannot fight it. Only people can fight it would be politicians, and it takes quite a politician to stand up to that kind of money. I mean, that reminds me of Woodrow Wilson saying his famous quote about there is a force behind the scenes that's so uh, evil that even the most highest businessmen will not speak about it above their breath. There is the controlling force behind the scenes that everyone seems to be, defers to ultimately, whatever that is. That's where we have the problem. And so the closest I can get to it is the Federal Reserve, and trying to break that down and give us some money that will actually help the country instead of strip us blind of our assets.
Well, that's what a Hamiltonian credit system would be. But you remember what happened to Henry Wallace? He was Franklin Roosevelt's vice president, and he was run out of office precisely because he was loyal to Roosevelt's conception, which is that you have to take care of the common man. You have to have a system which provides everyone an opportunity. And who replaced Wallace? Harry Truman.
Yeah.
Now, here's an interesting thing on this Truman question. Frederick Kemp, who's the chairman of the Atlantic Council, just had an essay or an op-ed 2 days ago where he said there's a danger that Biden will knuckle under to Putin. And he said what Biden has to do is follow the direction of Harry Truman. And Harry Truman was a puppet in the hands of Churchill. And the Wall Street crowd, the well-known suspects, the Dulles brothers, the Atchisons, the Warnkeys, people of that sort, who were the Wall Street bankers who set up the intelligence community after the war. And this is what they're saying Biden must do. I mean, it's very interesting, because if you were to say, put some hope that Biden will do something to stop the war, all you have to do is watch him at a press conference, and you have to say, my God, we're relying on this guy to handle this, what John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy did with the Cuban Missile Crisis. But you see, from the standpoint of the other side, they're terrified that people like Blinken and Victoria Nuland and Hillary Clinton can't pull it off. And here's where we come to what I think, John, is the most important point of this whole discussion. We had an opportunity after 2016 to bring down this cabal. When Trump said he wanted to drain the swamp, this is what we're talking about. But he became dependent on the swamp. I don't know if you've seen this, but there's a very fascinating report from Glenn Greenwald on why Trump did not pardon Snowden and or Assange. And essentially it boils down, and he got this from insiders, that Pompeo and Mitch McConnell told him that if he would have done that, the Republicans would have deserted him in the second impeachment trial, and he would have been convicted and never had a chance to run again. Now, I think that's the kind of blackmail that was done against Trump from the beginning by people like Bolton, by McMaster, by General Mattis, as well as the ganging up against him by the Obama intelligence machine, the media, and so on, to keep him from pursuing a relationship with Putin and Xi Jinping. And this is the lost opportunity of 2016 to 2020. And the thing to realize is if you're going to hang all the responsibility on Trump, you're putting too much on one person. That's why we need a movement. That's why we need a broad section of the population to understand the issues that you and I talk about every other week, about who the bad guys are, how they operate, how they control us. And if the American people were to take that step toward the higher level and focus on the highest strategic concepts, philosophical concepts, cultural concepts, we would have a chance to succeed. And where do we see people doing that in the world? The only figure I see who really exemplifies that quality of leadership is Vladimir Putin. And he's the demon from the standpoint of the oligarchy. And to some extent, you see an element of that in the economic policy of Xi Jinping in China. So these are the two bad boys when it comes to the US media, US politicians, both parties in Congress, and so on. So the American people have to figure that out and get up above that. And this time we really do have to drain the swamp.
We have to. A couple things, if I may. First, the answer to your question is that the media and the evil Democrats behind the scenes have made Trump into the scariest clown that scary clowns have ever been. You know, he has orange hair, for God's sake, you know, and he's, oh man, he's scary, 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 scary. So anything that you talk about in terms of reason or sitting back and saying, you know, maybe Biden's not right, or maybe we shouldn't have voted for Biden or anything. It's not even going to hit the radar screen, because everybody that voted for Biden did it because they can't stand the idea of Trump being the president. They have no further thought going into it than that if we don't vote for Biden, it's going to be Trump. And that's as sophisticated as my incredibly smart liberal friends ever get. I'm afraid.
Hey,
I'm
John,
sorry.
you know what it reminds me of? Do you remember, I don't know if you're old enough to remember this, but in 1964, there was this joke where Lyndon Johnson said, if you vote for Barry Goldwater, you'll get war. And the person said, well, and it's true, I voted for Barry Goldwater and we got more war.
I had a bumper sticker, AUH2064.
Yeah.
Goldwater 64. It was on
Yeah.
my bicycle because my dad was for Goldwater, and I didn't understand it. I thought my dad would be for the Democrats, but no, there I was. I guess I was about 10. Oh gosh. The other part. Oops, Toto just distracted me. Now I've lost my train of thought. I wanted to get back to Ukraine for maybe the last thought for this show. You know, as you know, Ukraine was the place where they had the collaborationist armies that still survive in the form of the Azov battalion and otherwise in Ukraine. It is. I've been studying General Charles Willoughby, who was famous as MacArthur's intelligence chief, quote unquote, but also a Prussian. His real name is Weidenbach, and he was from Essen, and he had that that Prussian militaristic attitude, and a lot of Prussians ended up in our military, including him, but also people like Wedemeyer and some others. This to me shocked me when I read in H.P. Albarelli's new book, Coup in Dallas, that this general, who was on MacArthur's staff and very close to him, was a big supporter of the OUN, the Stephen Bandera Army. And that troubling connection, you know, leads me to what it appears to me, what I call the synarchy, or what I'm trying to study, and you all know more about the synarchy than I do now, but I'm studying it. It seems to me that the synarchy has placed Ukraine as the forefront of it's saying this is where we confront Russia, because the synarchy to me is very much allied with the goals of the 20th century Catholic Church, Pius XII, and the idea of fascism really being the best way to run a country. So Ukraine is um, their bulwark against communism, and also against the Slavic nations generally, and against, so is when we talk about Bolton and other people behind the scenes, I associate them more with the interests of this synarchy than I do with the interest of the United States of America. In other words, I think, when we look and we say it's Putin versus Biden. No, I don't think it's Putin versus Biden. I think that Putin and Biden are both dealing with something in between them that is, you calling the oligarchy, I'm calling the synarchy. So let me just throw that out there and let you finish up the show with your thoughts on that.
Well, that is the synarchists, because the synarchists are essentially a movement among the global corporate cartels, what was called in the 20s the trusts. And their view was that they had to be above the state, and that if they had the power, to use the state to impose their policies. Now, an example of this is Felix Rohatyn, who came from Lazard Frere. Lazard Frere, Eugene Meyer, who set up the Washington Post. These are people who would fund Democrats, they'd fund Republicans. The synarchist movement in Europe funded the fascists and the communists. They were left and right. They, in fact, used the left and right to manipulate people. Their policy was to keep control in the hands of the elite oligarchs. And so they would do whatever they could to be disruptive, a disruptive force. Now, one of the reasons it worked in Ukraine is that as part of Stalin's collectivization program, they conducted a relatively brutal campaign against what they called the rich peasants of Ukraine. Ukraine was the breadbasket, including for Russia, and during the time of the Soviet Union. Ukraine also, by the way, was the entry point of Christianity into the ancient Russian. The Kievan Rus was the place where where Christianity first set in. Now, what you have in Ukraine, though, in its modern form, is the aftermath of the Polish, Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Prussian Empire, the Russian Empire. They were constantly shifting sides based on who came in and conquered them. And so you have a certain group of so-called Ukrainian nationalists who saw in Bandera and the Nazi SS as their potential saviors against Stalin's communists, against the Polish Jews, Hungarian Jews, Ukrainian Jews, the Romanians. They're basically for ethnic cleansing of Ukraine. Those are the people who are marching in the Azov battalion. They're the ones who want to exterminate the Russians in eastern Ukraine. And they're the ones who are standing at the forefront of 100,000 Ukrainian troops on the Dnieper River, which is the dividing line between Kievan Ukraine and the Donbas region. And when people talk about the Russian troops that are massed, no one talks about the Ukrainian troops that are massed. But inside those Ukrainian troops are the Azov battalion security forces who are committed to the tradition of the Ukrainians who joined the SS when Hitler took over Ukraine. That's the danger. They were the ones that Victoria Nuland unleashed on the Maidan Square to carry out these sniper attacks that killed more than 100 people on the Maidan Square, killing both the Ukrainian security forces and the demonstrators. They're the people who burned 30-something people in an Odessa trade union building. They're the ones who launched drone attacks into eastern Ukraine. So these are the marchers that are deployed by the synarchists. And the synarchists care nothing about the people of Ukraine. If they did, they would never have unleashed the IMF on them. So you're absolutely right. This is something that people have to study, because during the period before World War II, Franklin Roosevelt assigned a group in what became later the OSS to study this phenomena of the left-right being essentially unified against the state and controlling the state. And they called it the Synarchist Nazi Communist Movement. And this has been pretty much written out of the history books. But what does it go back to? Napoleon and the whole idea of left and right in the French Parliament as an arbitrary phenomenon, where the real question was who would control it from the top. And this is what we talk about as the corporate cartels, or the Davos elite, the World Economic Forum, the role of the House of Windsor, and the old Venetian Roman nobility that controls still so much of the banking system of Europe. So that's the real enemy. And who is their enemy? The American system, because the American system is the most effective, coherent attack on this form of the Venetian Dutch, Anglo-Dutch system that was ever set up. And that's why they're trying to destroy anyone like LaRouche or Trump, who approximates the outlook that was that of the founding fathers.
I think whenever we do speak of Lyndon LaRouche, I think it's important to note his courage and his sacrifice, and the fact that he and so many of his colleagues spent years in prison at the behest of the same Robert S. Mueller that ran the Trump, Russiagate stuff. Yeah. This is serious stuff, and people who might disagree with what LaRouche says on this or that, I think everybody needs to stop and say, wow, this man was not only was he a genius, but he had tremendous courage, and your organization keeps that flame alive. I benefit tremendously from your work, Harley, and while I'll continue to argue with you over the jab mandates, and one of our chat folks is saying that Senator Johnson's presentation yesterday is very, very good. A number of medical experts on there that are worth looking at. So I'll leave that with you. Maybe some folks at Schiller or LaRouche will look into Senator Johnson's hearing yesterday to maybe see that not all the opposition is made up of kooks and disinformation artists, which that terrifies me. The idea that the whole liberal world is convinced that everybody that opposes jabs is basing their opposition on some of the clown tactics that are thrown out there by the very people that are running the scam in the first place. Anyway, I'm sorry for saying it that way. I know but I respect our disagreement. But more importantly, I really treasure our conversations. Thank you again, Harley.
Well, and I'll just finish by saying I was Mr. LaRouche's spokesman for the last 20 years of his life. And he was an extraordinary figure. He never backed down from a fight, but he always listened, and he always tried to come up with a flank. He said, we have to have a flank that someone doesn't know is a flank.
All right. We'll leave it there. Thanks, everybody.